Racist doctor refuses to treat a black kid, who later becomes a renowned doctor and saves his life. And then the doctor did something which no one expected. So let's dive deep into the story. Before that, please subscribe our channel for 5 years of good luck. We really care for you. It was a chilly winter afternoon, and the sky was covered in thick gray clouds. The air outside was crisp, and the streets were almost empty. Inside the small apartment, 8-year-old Jamal lay on the couch, shivering. His mother, Mrs. Thomas, had noticed that Jamal hadn't been feeling well for a few days. He had a fever that wouldn't go away, and his stomach hurt so badly that he couldn't eat his favorite food, pizza. Mrs. Thomas sat beside him, gently brushing his forehead with the back of her hand. "Jamal, honey, how do you feel?" she asked softly, her voice full of worry. Jamal coughed weakly and looked up at her. "I feel really tired, Mom," he whispered. His small face was pale, and his eyes were droopy. Mrs. Thomas knew that this wasn't just a regular sickness. For the past few days, Jamal had been complaining about a sharp pain in his stomach. He couldn't sleep well at night, tossing and turning, and every time he tried to eat, his stomach hurt even more. She knew that something was wrong, and the worry was growing in her heart. Mrs. Thomas decided it was time to take Jamal to the hospital. She had put it off for as long as she could, hoping that the fever would go away on its own. But now, she couldn't wait any longer. She had to make sure her boy was okay. She helped Jamal sit up and get dressed. He was so weak that he needed her help to pull on his jacket. "Let's go, baby. We'll get you some help," Mrs. Thomas said as she carefully wrapped a scarf around Jamal's neck. He nodded weakly but didn't say anything. He was too tired to argue. Mrs. Thomas called for a taxi, and within minutes, the car pulled up outside their apartment building. The ride to the hospital felt long to Jamal, and even longer for his mother. She kept glancing at Jamal, who was slumped in the back seat, clutching his stomach with both hands. He was trying to be brave, but the pain was clearly making him miserable. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Mrs. Thomas hurried inside with Jamal in tow. The emergency room was buzzing with activity. Doctors and nurses were moving quickly, attending to other patients, while families waited anxiously for their turn. Mrs. Thomas approached the receptionist and explained Jamal's condition. The receptionist quickly took their details and handed Mrs. Thomas a form to fill out. Once they had completed the paperwork, they were ushered into the waiting area. Jamal sat down in a chair, clutching his mother's hand. His stomach was aching so much now that he could barely keep his eyes open. He leaned his head against his mother's shoulder and tried to find some comfort in her warmth. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm scared." His voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Thomas squeezed his hand and kissed the top of his head. "Don't be scared, Jamal," she said softly. "We're going to get you better. I'm right here with you." The minutes passed slowly. It felt like hours to Mrs. Thomas. She couldn't stop worrying about Jamal. She had always taken him to the doctor for checkups, but this time felt different. She could sense something more serious was wrong. She just prayed that the doctors would be able to help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a nurse called them to the back. Jamal and Mrs. Thomas followed her down a long hallway to an examination room. The nurse helped Jamal sit on the bed and took his temperature, then asked him some questions about how he was feeling. Jamal answered as best as he could, but his answers were short because he was so tired. A few minutes later, Dr. Smith, a tall man with glasses, entered the room. He was wearing a white coat and had a stethoscope around his neck. He smiled at Jamal and Mrs. Thomas, but the smile didn't seem warm. It felt more like a quick, polite gesture. "So, what seems to be the problem?" Dr. Smith asked, looking down at his clipboard. Mrs. Thomas quickly explained Jamal's symptoms. "He's been running a fever for days now, and his stomach has been hurting a lot. I'm really worried about him, doctor. He's so weak, and I don't know what's wrong." Dr. Smith nodded, but his face remained neutral. He glanced at Jamal, who was lying back on the examination bed, his eyes half closed. "Well, it's probably just a stomach bug," Dr. Smith said casually, barely making eye contact with Jamal. "Most of these things pass with some rest and fluids. I don't think it's anything too serious." Mrs. Thomas frowned. She knew something wasn't right. "But his pain, doctor, it's really bad. It's been going on for days. Can't you do some tests to check?" Dr. Smith looked at her and shook his head slightly. "Look, I've seen plenty of kids come in with stomach pain. Most of the time, it's just something minor. It's not worth getting too worked up over. I recommend you just take him home, give him some soup, and let him rest." Mrs. Thomas's heart sank. "But doctor, what if it's something more serious? What if he needs treatment?" Dr. Smith sighed, clearly irritated now. "You're overreacting," he said, his tone becoming sharp. "He's fine. There's no need to worry so much. Just take him home, and he'll be better in a few days." Mrs. Thomas felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over her. She couldn't understand why Dr. Smith was being so dismissive. She had come here because she was scared for Jamal's life, and he wasn't taking her concerns seriously. "Please, doctor, I'm asking you," she said, her voice trembling. "I need you to help my son." Dr. Smith looked at her and rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, "Fine, I'll take a quick look and see if anything's wrong." He glanced at Jamal again, but his face seemed uninterested. He quickly checked Jamal's abdomen, barely pressing down. "No sign of anything serious," he said as he scribbled something on the chart. "You can take him home." Mrs. Thomas felt tears prick her eyes. She was scared, and she knew Dr. Smith wasn't going to do anything to help Jamal. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to hold back the tears. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice breaking. She took Jamal's hand and led him out of the room, hoping that somehow her instincts were wrong. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Mrs. Thomas and Jamal left the examination room in silence. The weight of Dr. Smith's dismissive words hung heavy in the air. Jamal, who had been so tired and in pain, couldn't even muster the energy to speak. He leaned against his mother as they walked down the hospital corridor, his small hand still holding hers tightly. "Mom," Jamal whispered, his voice weak and trembling, "what's going to happen now?" Mrs. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to hold back her tears. Her heart was heavy with worry. She had trusted Dr. Smith to help her son, but now she felt completely powerless. Jamal's pain wasn't going away, and yet the doctor had refused to help him. It was hard to accept that a doctor, someone who was supposed to be kind and helpful, could act like this. She pulled Jamal closer to her and kissed the top of his head. "We'll be okay, Jamal," she said softly, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "We're going to figure this out. We just have to go home for now." They made their way out of the hospital and back to the taxi. The driver, seeing how tired Jamal looked, asked them if everything was okay. Mrs. Thomas smiled weakly, but didn't say anything. The taxi ride felt long and silent. The kind of silence that's filled with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. Jamal stared out the window, watching the city go by, but seeing nothing. His body was sore, and his head was heavy. He wanted to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, his stomach ached again. When they finally arrived home, Mrs. Thomas helped Jamal to bed. She made sure he was tucked in with his favorite blanket, the one with the bright blue stars. She sat beside him, brushing his hair back from his forehead, trying to comfort him. But even as she did this, she couldn't shake the growing worry in her chest. She had felt something was wrong the moment Dr. Smith dismissed her concerns. But now it seemed like there was nothing more she could do. "Mom, I'm scared," Jamal whispered, his small voice barely audible. He was trying to be brave, but the pain in his stomach made it hard to hide his fear. "What if I'm really sick?" Mrs. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for Jamal. She squeezed his hand gently. "We're going to be okay, Jamal. You're strong, and we'll get through this. I'm right here with you, always." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the worry that something more serious might be happening. She stayed with Jamal, keeping watch as he slept fitfully. But the hours passed, and his fever remained high. The pain in his stomach was still there, and Mrs. Thomas knew she couldn't just sit by and do nothing. She had to find a way to get Jamal the help he needed, no matter what. The next morning, Jamal was still feeling weak and sick. His mother decided that she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to take him to a different doctor, someone who would actually listen to her concerns and take Jamal's condition seriously. She called the clinic again, but this time she didn't stop at the receptionist. She asked to speak to the head nurse. "Please, I need to see a different doctor," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice full of urgency. "My son is still sick, and I feel like no one is taking him seriously. I can't wait any longer." The nurse listened carefully and promised to arrange an appointment with a new doctor. Mrs. Thomas felt a small sense of relief. but it was quickly replaced by the same deep concern that had been with her since the day before. What if this doctor turned her away, too? What if they refused to help? They arrived at the new clinic later that morning. Jamal was still holding his stomach, and his face was pale. Mrs. Thomas had called ahead, and this time, she was determined to make sure that they didn't get sent home without the help Jamal needed. When they walked into the clinic, the receptionist greeted them warmly. "How can we help you today?" she asked. "I need to see a doctor right away," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice filled with urgency. "My son is very sick, and I'm really worried." The receptionist looked at Jamal, who was looking up at her with big, sad eyes. She immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "I'll let the doctor know you're here," she said, giving them a reassuring smile. It wasn't long before a nurse came out and led them to an examination room. This time, the nurse was kind and gentle, and she didn't seem hurried or indifferent like Dr. Smith had been. Jamal was able to lie down on the examination bed without feeling rushed. Mrs. Thomas sat beside him, her heart still pounding in her chest. The new doctor, Dr. Gonzalez, walked in a few minutes later. She was a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She looked at Jamal and then at Mrs. Thomas. "I hear you've been having a rough time," Dr. Gonzalez said softly. "Let's take a good look at what's going on, okay?" Mrs. Thomas nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. This doctor seemed different. She wasn't rushing to judgment. She was listening. Dr. Gonzalez asked Jamal about his symptoms and gently examined his stomach. She pressed her hands softly against his abdomen, asking him if it hurt when she touched certain spots. Jamal winced a little, but he didn't cry out like he had the day before. This time, he felt like someone cared about what he was going through. After the examination, Dr. Gonzalez looked at Mrs. Thomas seriously. "I think we need to do some tests," she said. "There's something more going on here, and we need to find out what it is. I don't think this is just a stomach bug." Mrs. Thomas felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had been so afraid that her concerns would be brushed aside again, but this doctor was taking her seriously. She could see it in Dr. Gonzalez's face. This doctor was ready to help Jamal. "Thank you, doctor," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've been so scared. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to be okay." Dr. Gonzalez gave her a reassuring smile. "We're going to do everything we can to help him," she said. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Jamal, still tired but now feeling a little bit better, looked up at his mother. "Mom, do you think I'm going to be okay?" Mrs. Thomas leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I know you're going to be okay, Jamal. We're going to make sure of it." As they waited for the tests to be done, Mrs. Thomas stayed close to Jamal, holding his hand and giving him the comfort and love he needed. She knew the road ahead might still be difficult, but now, for the first time since yesterday, she felt like they had a chance. Jamal lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His small body was barely able to move, and his stomach hurt so much that every breath felt like a struggle. The fever hadn't gone away, and now his entire body felt weak and drained. His mother, Mrs. Thomas, had stayed up all night by his side, watching him toss and turn, rubbing his back whenever he complained of pain. She had tried to stay calm, but the fear in her heart was growing every minute. She knew something was wrong, something more serious than just a simple stomach bug. But what could she do? She had already taken him to the hospital, and the doctor there had brushed her off. Dr. Smith had told her that Jamal was fine, that it was nothing to worry about. But she knew better. Jamal's breathing was shallow, and every now and then, he clutched his stomach in agony. "Mom, it hurts," he whispered through clenched teeth. His voice was weak, and his eyes were cloudy with fever. Mrs. Thomas could feel the heat radiating from his small body. She leaned in and gently touched his forehead. "You're so warm, Jamal. We need to get you some help, baby," she murmured, her voice full of concern. She glanced at the clock. It was late in the afternoon, and she had already tried everything she could think of to make him feel better. She had given him water, soup, and medicine for his fever, but nothing was working. Mrs. Thomas paced the small room. She knew she had to do something more. She had to get Jamal the help he needed. She couldn't stand seeing him in so much pain. The fear gnawed at her insides, and she felt helpless. Jamal's breathing became more labored, and he moaned quietly. Mrs. Thomas knelt beside him, holding his hand her heart heavy with worry. "Please, Jamal, I need you to hang in there, okay? Just a little longer, and we'll get you to the doctor again. We'll find someone who will really help you," she said, her voice cracking. She wiped a tear away before Jamal could see it. She didn't want to scare him. She needed to be strong for him, even though she was terrified. For the next few hours, Jamal barely spoke. His fever was making him feel dizzy and confused. He would drift in and out of sleep, sometimes whimpering as he shifted in bed. Mrs. Thomas was always right there, stroking his hair and telling him that everything was going to be okay. But deep down, she was scared. She knew that Jamal was not getting better, and that scared her more than anything. Around midnight, Mrs. Thomas finally decided that she couldn't wait any longer. She picked up the phone and dialed the hospital again, this time more forcefully. She demanded to speak with someone higher up in the hospital. She couldn't trust Dr. Smith anymore. She had to make sure Jamal got the care he needed, no matter what it took. The receptionist answered the phone with a sleepy voice, but Mrs. Thomas wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "I need to speak to someone about my son, Jamal. He's still very sick, and the doctor you sent us to won't listen to me. I want him seen by someone else now," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice sharp with determination. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, but then agreed to transfer her to the head nurse. The nurse listened patiently as Mrs. Thomas explained the situation again. She told the nurse how Jamal's fever hadn't gone away, how he was still in pain, and how Dr. Smith had told her it was nothing to worry about. The nurse was quiet for a moment, then promised to call the on-call doctor right away. Mrs. Thomas clutched the phone tightly, feeling a flicker of hope. "I'll take care of it. Someone will be with you shortly," the nurse assured her. Mrs. Thomas thanked her and hung up the phone. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew this was her last chance. If Jamal wasn't seen by a doctor soon, she was afraid of what could happen next. She sat down on the edge of Jamal's bed and watched him sleep, his small chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. His face was pale, and his body was limp under the covers. The pain he was experiencing was so real, so overwhelming, and it broke her heart to see him suffer. Mrs. Thomas stayed by Jamal's side, her eyes glued to him, her heart racing. She could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, and she felt a pang of fear. The hospital was just a few minutes away, and she knew she had to get Jamal back there as soon as possible. She had to make sure he was seen by someone who would take his illness seriously. Not long after the phone call, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Thomas quickly stood up and opened it, finding a nurse standing there with a concerned look on her face. "We've arranged for a new doctor to see Jamal," the nurse said gently. "I'm sorry for the delay, but we'll get him checked out right away." Mrs. Thomas nodded gratefully, feeling tears well up in her eyes. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, someone was going to help her son. The nurse helped Mrs. Thomas gather Jamal's things, and they made their way back to the hospital. Jamal was still groggy, barely able to keep his eyes open. Mrs. Thomas held him close, hoping that this new doctor would be different, that they would finally get the answers they so desperately needed. When they arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere felt different. The staff were more attentive, and Mrs. Thomas could see the concern on their faces. They moved quickly to get Jamal into a room, and within minutes, a new doctor, Dr. Gonzalez, arrived. Dr. Gonzalez was a warm woman with kind eyes and a soft voice. She immediately knelt down beside Jamal and asked him how he was feeling. She took her time listening to Mrs. Thomas, and for the first time since all this began, Mrs. Thomas felt like someone cared. Dr. Gonzalez didn't rush through her questions or dismiss Jamal's pain. She asked detailed questions about his symptoms and examined him carefully. She pressed her fingers gently on his stomach, and when Jamal winced in pain, the doctor's face tightened with concern. "We need to run some tests," Dr. Gonzalez said after examining Jamal. "I think there's something more going on here, and I want to make sure we catch it early." Mrs. Thomas felt a wave of relief. She had been so afraid that Jamal's suffering would be ignored again, but now it seemed like they were finally going to get the help they needed. Dr. Gonzalez explained that they would do a few tests to find out what was causing Jamal's pain and fever. She assured Mrs. Thomas that they would take care of everything. As Jamal was wheeled away for the tests, Mrs. Thomas sat alone in the waiting room. Her heart was still heavy with worry, but now, for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. She knew that Jamal was in good hands, and she prayed that this new doctor would be able to find out what was wrong before it got any worse. While Jamal was getting his tests, Mrs. Thomas took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. She thought about the cold in different way Dr. Smith had treated her and Jamal. She thought about how, just a few days ago, she had been so full of fear and helplessness. But now, things were starting to look up. She had fought for her son, and she was determined not to stop until Jamal was safe and healthy again. Jamal was still very sick, but now Mrs. Thomas had hope. Hope that they were on the right path. The waiting room was quiet, the sound of the clock ticking the only thing Mrs. Thomas could hear as she sat alone. Her hands were folded in her lap, her thoughts racing with worry. Jamal was in another room, having tests done, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. The images of his pain and fever from earlier that night kept replaying in her mind. She had been so scared, so unsure of what to do, but now things were different. She had done everything she could to make sure Jamal was getting the care he needed. Dr. Gonzalez had promised that they would find out what was wrong, and Mrs. Thomas was clinging to that promise. Her mind kept drifting back to Dr. Smith, the doctor who had refused to help them, who had turned them away without a second thought. She had watched as Jamal's pain worsened and the fever stayed high, but Dr. Smith had barely glanced at him, just saying it was nothing to worry about. Mrs. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about how unfair it was that her son was suffering, and yet no one was listening to her. That thought still stung, and the feeling of helplessness made her angry. She knew Jamal needed help, and now she was determined to make sure that he would get it, no matter what. The door to the waiting room opened, and Dr. Gonzalez walked in with a folder in her hand. Her face was calm, but Mrs. Thomas could see the seriousness in her eyes. It made Mrs. Thomas's heart skip a beat. She stood up immediately. "How is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Gonzalez gave her a kind smile and gestured for her to sit. "Jamal's going to be okay, but we found something that needs to be treated right away," she said softly. "He's been struggling with something more than just a stomach bug." Mrs. Thomas's stomach tightened. She had known in her gut that there was more to this, but hearing the doctor say it aloud made the fear even more real. "What is it, doctor?" Mrs. Thomas asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Gonzalez sat down beside her. "Jamal is suffering from a severe infection in his appendix," she explained. "It's called appendicitis. This is what's causing the pain in his stomach, and it's very serious if it's not treated quickly." The words hit Mrs. Thomas like a punch to the gut. She felt her knees weaken, and she reached out to grab the back of the chair to steady herself. "Appendicitis?" she repeated, her mind struggling to process it. But we didn't even know. We thought it was just a stomach bug." Dr. Gonzalez nodded. "That's a very common misconception. Appendicitis can start out looking like something minor, like a stomach ache or fever, but if it's not treated, it can lead to much more serious problems. In Jamal's case, it looks like it's gotten pretty bad." Mrs. Thomas felt tears sting her eyes. She was relieved to finally have an answer, but the thought that Jamal had been suffering like this, and she hadn't known, filled her with guilt and fear. What if they hadn't come to the hospital? What if Dr. Smith had just sent them home again? What if it had gotten worse? "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice breaking. Dr. Gonzalez placed a reassuring hand on Mrs. Thomas's shoulder. "Yes, he's going to be fine. We're going to treat it right away. We'll need to perform surgery to remove the appendix, but this is a routine procedure. He'll be in the hospital for a few days afterward, but he'll recover quickly." Mrs. Thomas let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. Jamal was going to be okay. The thought that he was going to get better, that he was going to be safe, brought her to the verge of tears. "I'm so scared," Mrs. Thomas whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "I've been so scared. I didn't know what was wrong with him, and I didn't know what to do." Dr. Gonzalez gave her a soft smile. "I understand, Mrs. Thomas. This is a very scary situation, but you did the right thing. You fought for Jamal when you felt something was wrong, and that's what matters. You didn't give up, and because of that, he's going to be okay." Mrs. Thomas wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. She had to be strong for Jamal. She couldn't let him see how scared she was. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for believing in him." I was so scared we'd be sent home again, that they wouldn't take him seriously." Dr. Gonzalez nodded, her expression turning more serious. "It's important to always trust your instincts as a parent. You know your child better than anyone else. And when something doesn't feel right, you have to speak up, no matter what. I'm sorry that Dr. Smith didn't listen to you. That shouldn't have happened. And I hope this will be a reminder that every patient deserves to be heard." Mrs. Thomas nodded in agreement. She was still angry at the way she and Jamal had been treated by Dr. Smith, but she was also grateful that things were finally looking up. She had been afraid that they'd never get the right treatment, that Jamal's condition would get worse before anyone realized how serious it was. But now, thanks to Dr. Gonzalez, they had an answer, and they were going to get the treatment they needed. "How soon can the surgery be done?" Mrs. Thomas asked, feeling a new sense of urgency. "We can get him in as soon as possible," Dr. Gonzalez replied. "The sooner we remove the appendix, the better. We don't want it to burst or cause any more problems." Mrs. Thomas nodded again, feeling a little more at ease knowing that the surgery would be done quickly. She could already picture Jamal back to his old self, running around, laughing and feeling better. It was a relief to know that the pain he had been feeling would soon be over. But still, there was part of her that remained anxious. Surgery was always risky, and even though Dr. Gonzalez assured her that it was a routine procedure, the idea of her son being wheeled into an operating room was terrifying. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all this, Jamal," Mrs. Thomas whispered to herself. "But you're so strong, baby. You're going to be okay." Dr. Gonzalez left the room to make the arrangements for the surgery. Mrs. Thomas sat there, trying to gather her thoughts. She was still processing everything, still trying to understand how something so serious could have gone unnoticed for so long. She thought about how much pain Jamal had been in, and how terrified he had been when he couldn't explain what was happening to his body. She thought about the sleepless nights, the worry, the constant questioning. Now, it all made sense. The door opened again, and this time it was a nurse who entered with a wheelchair. "Mrs. Thomas, we're ready to take Jamal into surgery," the nurse said, her voice gentle. Mrs. Thomas stood up, her legs feeling a little shaky. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been so scared, so unsure about what would happen next. But now, she had an answer. She had hope, and Jamal was going to be okay. As the nurse wheeled Jamal into the operating room, Mrs. Thomas walked beside them, holding his hand tightly. Jamal was still weak, but his eyes followed his mother's face as she talked to him softly, trying to comfort him. "Mom, I'm scared," Jamal whispered, his voice small and unsure. Mrs. Thomas smiled down at him. "I know, baby, but you're going to be okay. Dr. Gonzalez is going to take care of you. I'll be right here when you wake up." Jamal nodded, his eyes fluttering shut as the anesthesia began to take effect. Mrs. Thomas watched him go, her heart still heavy but filled with a new sense of hope. Soon, her son would be healthy again, and they would both leave this hospital stronger than ever. As she waited for the surgery to end, Mrs. Thomas felt a mix of relief, fear, and gratitude. She had fought for her son's health. She had trusted her instincts, and she had found someone who believed in him, who truly cared. And the hours after Jamal's surgery felt like a blur to Mrs. Thomas. She paced back and forth in the waiting room, her heart racing as the minutes ticked by. The surgery had gone well, the doctors assured her, but the worry never left her mind. She had been holding her breath the whole time, waiting to hear those simple words, "He's okay." Now, with Jamal in recovery, all Mrs. Thomas wanted to do was see her son, hold his hand, and tell him that everything was going to be all right. Finally, the nurse came out and told Mrs. Thomas that Jamal was awake and stable. A wave of relief washed over her as she followed the nurse down the hallway to Jamal's room. Her heart felt lighter with each step, but there was still a small knot of worry in her stomach. Would Jamal be in pain? Would he be scared when he woke up? When Mrs. Thomas stepped into Jamal's room, she saw him lying in bed, his small body surrounded by blankets. He looked pale, but he was awake, and his eyes followed her as she entered. For a moment, Jamal's face was blank, as if he wasn't sure where he was or what had happened. But then, slowly, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips when he saw his mother. "Mom," Jamal whispered, his voice weak and shaky. Mrs. Thomas hurried to his side and sat on the edge of the bed, gently taking his hand in hers. "Hey, baby, it's me," she said, her voice filled with warmth and relief. "You did great. The surgery is over, and you're going to feel better soon." Jamal blinked slowly, as if the words were taking a moment to register. He looked down at his stomach, where the bandages covered the spot where his appendix had been removed. It doesn't hurt anymore," he said softly, his eyes a little wide with surprise. Mrs. Thomas smiled through her tears. "That's because the doctors fixed everything. You're going to be just fine now. You'll be out of here in no time, and you can start feeling like yourself again." Jamal's face lit up with a small, exhausted smile. "I was so scared, Mom. I didn't know what was happening. I thought I was going to be sick forever." Mrs. Thomas squeezed his hand tightly, her voice soothing. "I know, baby, but you're stronger than you think. And now you're on the road to getting better. We're going to get through this together." For the next few hours, Jamal rested while Mrs. Thomas stayed by his side. He was tired, and the anesthesia still made him feel groggy, but he seemed more comfortable now that the pain was gone. The worst part, the waiting, the uncertainty, the fear was over. Mrs. Thomas felt a wave of relief every time she looked at him, knowing that he was healing. The days after the surgery were slow, but there was a sense of progress in each passing hour. Jamal's fever had finally gone down, and his appetite, which had been absent for days, started to return. Mrs. Thomas could tell that Jamal was beginning to feel better when he asked for some food, even if it was just a small bowl of soup. The nurses checked on him regularly, making sure his vital signs were stable and that his body was healing properly. Jamal was sleepy, but the nurses were kind, and every time they came in, they reassured Mrs. Thomas that everything was going smoothly. Dr. Gonzalez, the doctor who had saved Jamal's life, came by to visit him every day, checking his recovery progress and making sure that the wound from the surgery was healing well. "You're doing really well, Jamal," Dr. Gonzalez said on the third day after the surgery. "I'm really impressed with how quickly you're bouncing back. You're going to be up and moving around before you know it." Jamal smiled weakly. "I feel a lot better now. My tummy doesn't hurt anymore, and I don't feel as tired." "That's great to hear," Dr. Gonzalez said. "You just need to take it easy for a little while longer. Your body needs time to heal, but you're on the right track." Mrs. Thomas sat by Jamal's bed, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had been so scared that Jamal wouldn't make it through the surgery, that something might go wrong. But now, she saw her son getting stronger every day. The pain had faded, and the boy who had been lying in bed, sick and weak, was beginning to look more like the energetic, curious boy she knew and loved. During this time, Mrs. Thomas reflected on the past few days. She thought about how the doctors at the hospital had listened to her when Dr. Smith had refused to. How Jamal's life had been saved because she had trusted her instincts and fought for his care. It still hurt to think about Dr. Smith, about the way Jamal had been brushed off and dismissed. But now it didn't matter. Jamal was alive. He was healing. And that was what mattered most. Mrs. Thomas spent her days talking to Jamal, reading him his favorite books, and telling him stories to keep his mind off the hospital room. She told him about the things they would do when he was better, going to the park, playing basketball, and eating his favorite food at the diner. She kept reminding him that this was just a temporary bump in the road. Soon, he'd be back to his old self. Jamal wasn't the same as he had been before the surgery. He was still weak, still recovering, but there was a light in his eyes again, a hope that had been absent for a while. Mrs. Thomas could see the resilience in him, the same strength she had seen in him ever since he was a little boy. Jamal was strong, and no matter what happened, he would come through this. As the days passed, Jamal began to show more signs of improvement. He was able to sit up in bed without feeling dizzy, and after a week, he was even able to stand up and walk around the room, though with a little help. It was slow, but it was progress. Mrs. Thomas watched each small victory with pride and relief. She knew that soon, Jamal would be out of the hospital and back to his normal life, playing with his friends, going to school, and just being a kid again. One afternoon, when Jamal was feeling a bit stronger, Mrs. Thomas sat with him by the window. The sun was shining outside, and the sky was clear. Jamal stared out the window for a moment, his eyes soft and thoughtful. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't want to go back to the hospital. I don't want to be sick anymore." Mrs. Thomas squeezed his hand gently. "You're not sick anymore, baby. You're going to get better. And soon, we'll be going home. You can play and have fun again. I promise." Jamal looked up at her, his face serious but filled with hope. "I know, Mom. I don't want to be scared anymore." Mrs. Thomas leaned in and kissed his forehead. "You're not scared anymore, Jamal. We got through it. You're stronger than you think. And every day, you're getting better." As the days passed and Jamal's recovery continued, Mrs. Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the doctors, nurses, and everyone who had been a part of Jamal's care. She had watched her son go through something that no parent should have to see, but now she saw him getting stronger. The fear that had once taken over her heart was being replaced with the joy of seeing her son on the road to full recovery. And Jamal? He was starting to feel like himself again. His smile was coming back, and so was his energy. He was still weak, but each day brought more hope, more healing. His courage and resilience were inspiring, and Mrs. Thomas knew that Jamal had a bright future ahead of him, one filled with health, happiness, and strength. Soon enough, the day came when Jamal was finally allowed to go home. He was still tired, but he was walking on his own, and his steps were full of determination. Mrs. Thomas helped him into the car, and as they drove away from the hospital, she looked at her son with a heart full of love. They had been through so much, but now it was over. Jamal was going to be okay. Jamal was finally home. After spending several days in the hospital, his mother, Mrs. Thomas, had brought him back to their cozy apartment. It was a simple place with a small kitchen and 2 bedrooms, but it was filled with love. The walls were lined with pictures of family vacations, school pictures, and drawings Jamal had made when he was younger. The air in the apartment felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of worry had been lifted. Mrs. Thomas could still remember the days she had spent pacing in the hospital waiting rooms, the fear that had gripped her every time she saw Jamal lying in that hospital bed. But now he was home, and things were beginning to feel normal again. Jamal was still weak, but he had come a long way in the week since his surgery. He spent most of his time lying on the couch or in bed, resting and recovering. He was tired, but Mrs. Thomas could tell he was slowly starting to regain his strength. She would sit beside him, talking to him about everything and anything, school, friends, and the things they would do once he was fully better. It was her way of keeping his spirits high, and it seemed to work. Jamal would listen quietly, his eyes brightening as he thought about all the things he would be able to do soon. Mrs. Thomas made sure to stay close to Jamal at all times. She cooked his favorite foods, simple things like chicken noodle soup, mashed potatoes, and toast, and made sure he drank plenty of water. She also made sure that Jamal took his medicine on time, just as the doctors had instructed. He wasn't happy about the medicine, but Mrs. Thomas reminded him that it was all part of getting better. "I know you don't like it, baby," she said one afternoon as Jamal grimaced after taking his medicine, "but this will help you heal faster. Soon, you'll be up and running around again. I promise." Jamal nodded, though his face still scrunched in distaste. "I know, Mom," he said softly. It's so yucky." Mrs. Thomas chuckled, sitting down beside him. "I know, baby. Medicine never tastes good, but we're almost done with it. And after that, you'll feel even better." The days passed slowly, but Jamal's recovery was going well. Each morning, he felt a little more energized. He was still too weak to run around, but he could sit up for longer periods of time without getting dizzy. He could even walk to the kitchen to get a snack without needing his mother's help. These small steps were signs that Jamal was getting stronger, and that made Mrs. Thomas feel hopeful. One afternoon, as Mrs. Thomas was cleaning up the kitchen, Jamal sat on the couch, flipping through a book. She could hear the faint sound of his voice as he murmured to himself, reading the words softly. It was a habit he had picked up when he was younger, reading aloud to himself, as if the words needed to be spoken in order for him to understand them better. It made her smile. "Mom," Jamal said, closing the book and looking up at her. "When I grow up, I want to be a doctor. I want to help people like the doctors who helped me." Mrs. Thomas paused in her cleaning, a soft smile spreading across her face. "That's a wonderful dream, Jamal," she said, walking over to sit beside him on the couch. "You've always been so kind-hearted and caring. I have no doubt you could do it. Jamal's eyes lit up. I want to help people like they helped me. I want to be someone who makes people feel better when they're scared. Mrs. Thomas's heart swelled with pride. She had always known that Jamal had a big heart, but hearing him express his desire to help others made her even more proud. She could see that the experience of his own illness had changed him. It had given him a new perspective on life. She had always taught him to be kind and thoughtful, but now, Jamal seemed to understand just how important it was to help others in times of need. "That's a beautiful dream, Jamal," Mrs. Thomas said, her voice soft and filled with love. "And I know that one day you will be able to do it. You have the strength, the courage, and the heart to make a real difference in the world." Jamal smiled and leaned his head on his mother's shoulder. "I'm going to be a doctor, Mom. I'm going to help people who are scared like I was." Mrs. Thomas kissed his forehead. "I believe in you, baby. You can do anything you set your mind to." The idea of Jamal becoming a doctor filled Mrs. Thomas with hope. She had spent so much time worrying about his health, fearing the worst. But now, she could see a future for him. A future where he was healthy, happy, and doing something meaningful. She knew that this experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. But instead of making him bitter or afraid, it had made him even more determined to help others. It was as if this experience had opened his heart in a way that would shape his entire future. A few days later, Jamal felt strong enough to go outside for a little while. Mrs. Thomas carefully helped him get dressed, making sure he was comfortable. Jamal was still weak, but the fresh air would do him good. They stepped outside onto the small balcony of their apartment, where Mrs. Thomas set up a chair for Jamal to sit in. The sun was bright, and the air was warm, just enough to make Jamal smile. "I miss this," Jamal said, breathing in deeply. "It feels good to be outside again." Mrs. Thomas stood beside him, watching him carefully. She smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Jamal had always loved the outdoors, and being outside made him feel free. She knew that it wouldn't be long before he was able to play with his friends again, to go back to his usual routine. But for now, she was happy to see him enjoying the small things, like the sunshine and the gentle breeze. "I miss this too, Jamal," Mrs. Thomas said softly. "It feels good to see you back to yourself, even if you're still getting better." Jamal nodded, his eyes squinting slightly as he looked out over the city. "I'm getting stronger, Mom. I know I am. I can't wait to go back to school and see my friends." The thought of school brought a sense of normalcy back into Mrs. Thomas's heart. She knew that Jamal would need time to fully recover before he could go back to his daily life. But she also knew that he was resilient. Jamal had always been a strong and determined boy, and now, more than ever, she saw that strength in him. He had faced something so scary, something that could have been much worse, but he had made it through. She knew that this experience would stay with him, and that it would shape the person he would become. As they sat outside, Mrs. Thomas thought about the time they had spent at the hospital, the fear she had felt, and the relief she now felt seeing her son getting stronger. She thought about how Jamal had been treated by that racist doctor, Dr. Smith, and how that had made everything even more difficult. But now, as she looked at her son, she realized something important. Jamal's strength and courage weren't just about physical recovery. It was about how he had faced the situation with bravery, how he had never given up, and how he had come out the other side even stronger. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal," Mrs. Thomas whispered, watching the city below. "You've been so brave through all of this. You've shown me just how strong you really are." Jamal looked up at her and smiled, his eyes shining with a mixture of relief and determination. "I'm going to be okay, Mom. And one day, I'm going to help people who need it, just like the doctors helped me." Mrs. Thomas nodded, feeling a rush of pride and love for her son. She knew that this was just the beginning of Jamal's journey, a journey that would be filled with challenges, dreams, and accomplishments. But no matter what happened, she knew one thing for sure: Jamal was going to be a fighter. Months passed since Jamal's surgery, and life started to feel more like normal. Jamal was back at school, surrounded by his friends and the familiar faces of his teachers. Though he was still cautious and made sure to take care of his health, his strength was coming back every day. His stomach wound had healed, and the last traces of his time in the hospital were fading into memory. But Jamal knew that he would never forget the experience. It had changed him in ways he couldn't yet explain. The school year was in full swing, and Jamal was focusing on his studies. He loved reading and math, and he found himself dreaming about the future, about the day he would become a doctor. His mother had been right beside him every step of the way, encouraging him and reminding him that he could achieve anything he set his mind to. Mrs. Thomas had also taken time off work to make sure Jamal was well cared for during his recovery. Their bond was stronger than ever, and Jamal felt grateful to have such a supportive mother. One Friday afternoon, after a long week of classes, Jamal walked home with his friends. They chatted excitedly about the upcoming weekend and what they planned to do. Jamal's friends knew about his surgery, and they had been kind and supportive since the day he came back to school. They asked him how he was feeling, and Jamal always smiled and said he was fine, even when he was still getting tired quicker than he used to. "I feel stronger every day," he told his friends, "and soon, I'll be back to playing basketball like before." When Jamal reached his apartment, he waved goodbye to his friends and headed inside. Mrs. Thomas was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, the smell of fried chicken and cornbread wafting through the air. Jamal's stomach growled. He was always hungry after a long day at school, but it was a good kind of hunger, one that meant his body was healing and growing stronger. "Hey, Mom," Jamal said as he walked in. "It smells amazing in here." Mrs. Thomas looked up from the stove and smiled. "I thought you might be hungry after your day at school. Go wash up. Dinner will be ready in a few minutes." Jamal nodded, eager to sit down and enjoy his meal. As he washed up in the bathroom, he thought about how much things had changed. Not just his health, but everything. He had once been so afraid, so unsure of what would happen. But now, he was looking toward the future with hope and excitement. He was determined to do great things, and the dream of becoming a doctor was becoming clearer in his mind with each passing day. After dinner, Mrs. Thomas and Jamal sat together in the living room. The evening was quiet, and Mrs. Thomas asked him about his day. They talked about his classes and the books he had been reading. Jamal had started reading more about medicine and health, fascinated by how the human body worked and how doctors could help people recover from illness. It was a topic he had always been curious about, but now it felt more personal. He felt a deep connection to the idea of healing others, a connection born from his own experience. Later that night, Mrs. Thomas sat on the couch, watching the evening news while Jamal lay in bed reading. The TV was on in the background, and a story caught Mrs. Thomas's attention. It was about a well-known hospital in the city that had recently opened a new health clinic for children. The clinic was designed to offer care to those who couldn't afford expensive treatments. The news segment showed doctors and nurses working with kids, providing care and comfort. Mrs. Thomas listened intently, and she heard something that made her pause. One of the doctors featured in the segment was Dr. Smith, the same doctor who had refused to treat Jamal months ago. Mrs. Thomas's heart sank, and she felt a knot in her stomach. She had tried to push the memory of Dr. Smith away, but now, seeing him on TV again, it all came rushing back. She remembered the way he had dismissed her and Jamal without even a second thought, simply because of their skin color. She had been so angry at the time, but seeing him now on the news, she felt a different emotion. She felt confused. "Jamal," Mrs. Thomas called, her voice trembling a little. "Come here for a second." Jamal walked into the living room, looking concerned. "What is it, Mom?" Mrs. Thomas pointed to the television. "Do you remember Dr. Smith? The doctor who wouldn't treat you?" Jamal turned to look at the screen, and his expression darkened as he saw the man on the screen, smiling as he spoke to the camera. "Yeah, I remember him, Mom. Why?" Mrs. Thomas sighed and leaned back, her hands resting on her lap. "I don't know how to feel about this. He's in the news working in a clinic to help kids. After everything he did to you." Jamal frowned, not sure what to make of it either. He didn't want to dwell on the past, especially not when he had so many good things to look forward to. But seeing Dr. Smith on TV was a reminder of the pain he had gone through. It felt like a strange twist of fate. Dr. Smith, the man who had treated him so poorly, now a face on the screen trying to help kids. Mrs. Thomas watched her son carefully, waiting for his reaction. She didn't know what Jamal would say, but she knew that he had grown stronger and more mature since his surgery. The experience had taught him many lessons about the world and about himself. and Mrs. Thomas hoped that he would continue to carry those lessons with him. Jamal stayed quiet for a moment, looking at the TV screen, his thoughts swirling in his head. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I guess people can change, Mom. Maybe he's trying to do better now. Maybe he's learned something." Mrs. Thomas blinked, surprised by Jamal's words. She had expected him to be angry or upset, to say something about how unfair it all was. But instead, Jamal was showing a different side of himself, a side that was more forgiving, more hopeful. He wasn't holding on to his anger, even though he had every right to. He was thinking about the possibility of growth, of redemption. "I don't know, Jamal," Mrs. Thomas said softly, shaking her head. "But I'm proud of you for not letting this stop you from chasing your dreams. If he can learn and become a better person, that's his journey, not yours." Jamal nodded slowly. "I just want to focus on what I can do. I want to be a doctor, and I want to help people. I don't want to think about him anymore." Mrs. Thomas smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're right, baby. What matters is that you've overcome this. You've shown so much strength, and I know you're going to do great things." Jamal smiled back, feeling the weight of the past lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he felt completely free of the anger and fear that had surrounded his experience with Dr. Smith. It didn't matter what that doctor did now. Jamal had his own path to follow, and it was filled with hope, compassion, and a desire to help others. As Jamal lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, he thought about his future. He thought about how he wanted to become a doctor, not just to heal people physically, but to make them feel seen, heard, and valued. His experience had taught him that there were people who would try to tear others down, but he didn't want to be one of them. He wanted to be someone who lifted others up, someone who could be the change in the world. The next morning, when Mrs. Thomas checked on Jamal before school, she found him sitting at his desk, reading a book about medicine. He was already planning his future, thinking about the steps he needed to take to make his dream come true. "I'll be okay, Mom," he said with a confident smile. "I'm going to do great things, I promise." Mrs. Thomas smiled back, knowing in her heart that her son was going to do just that. And nothing, not even Dr. Smith's presence on the television, could take away the future Jamal was creating for himself. Years passed, and Jamal grew older. The one small boy who had faced a life-threatening illness and an experience of racial injustice had transformed into a determined, confident young man. He was now in high school, excelling in his studies and pursuing his dream of becoming a doctor. The journey had been challenging, but every obstacle he encountered only made his resolve stronger. His experiences, both good and bad, shaped him into the person he was today, a person with a heart full of compassion and a mind focused on helping others. Jamal had always been determined to succeed. He had spent years studying hard, pushing himself academically, and participating in extracurricular activities that would build his leadership skills. He joined science clubs, volunteered at local health clinics, and shadowed doctors and hospitals, learning everything he could about medicine. His dream was becoming more and more tangible. But even as he pursued his studies, Jamal never forgot the painful experience that had sparked his desire to become a doctor. The time when a racist doctor had refused to treat him. It was a memory that haunted him, but also motivated him to be the kind of doctor who would never make anyone feel less than human. One morning, Jamal was scrolling through his phone when he saw an advertisement for a free health clinic in the city, hosted by one of the most prestigious hospitals in town. The clinic was aimed at providing medical care for low-income families and children, and it offered free health checkups, vaccinations, and other treatments. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the name of the hospital. It was the same hospital where he had been refused care years ago by Dr. Smith, the doctor who had let his own prejudice cloud his judgment. The memory flooded back, but instead of anger, Jamal felt something different. It was a mix of emotions: resolve, determination, and, oddly enough, a sense of closure. The advertisement said that the clinic would be staffed by many doctors from the hospital, including Dr. Smith. It was strange, Jamal thought. How could the same man who had treated him so poorly be involved in something that was supposed to help people? Was this a genuine effort to change, or was it just for show? Jamal couldn't help but wonder, but he decided not to let the past hold him back. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture. He knew that his dream of becoming a doctor wasn't about the mistakes of others. It was about what he could do to help people. He had learned that the only way to create change was to lead by example, and he wasn't going to let one bad experience prevent him from moving forward. That weekend, Jamal volunteered at the clinic. His mother, Mrs. Thomas, had always supported his decision to pursue medicine, and she was incredibly proud of how far he had come. She helped him get prepared, making sure he had his volunteer badge and knew the directions to the clinic. She gave him a hug before he left, saying, "Remember, Jamal, you're here to help people. What matters most is that you're making a difference, not the past." When Jamal arrived at the clinic, it was bustling with activity. People were waiting in line to get checked, some with their children in tow. Jamal was assigned to assist the medical staff, helping with paperwork, guiding patients to the right stations, and providing comfort to those who were nervous about their appointments. He felt at home in the clinic, surrounded by doctors, nurses, and other volunteers who were all there for one purpose: to help. It was everything Jamal had imagined when he thought about his future as a doctor. As he was walking around, helping a mother and her child, Jamal noticed Dr. Smith. The doctor was wearing his lab coat, speaking to patients and directing the nurses. He was older now, his hair graying, and there was a certain tiredness in his eyes. Jamal watched him for a moment, his heart racing. Part of him wanted to confront the man, to ask him how he could be involved in a clinic that was meant to help people, especially after the way he had treated Jamal all those years ago. But the other part of him, the part that had grown and healed, knew that he had to focus on the present, not the past. That's when Dr. Smith noticed Jamal. The two locked eyes for a brief moment, and Jamal felt a rush of emotion. He saw Dr. Smith's expression change, just slightly, but enough for Jamal to see that the doctor recognized him. Jamal held his ground, but he didn't say anything. There was a long pause, and then Dr. Smith walked over to him. "Jamal," Dr. Smith said softly, his voice a little hesitant. "It's been a long time. How are you?" Jamal didn't know how to respond at first. He had imagined this moment in his head many times, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure what he wanted to say. The young boy he once was had been angry, confused, and hurt by Dr. Smith's actions. But now, Jamal was older, wiser, and more focused on the future than on revenge or bitterness. "I'm doing well," Jamal said slowly. "I'm volunteering here today, helping out. I want to become a doctor." Dr. Smith looked surprised. For a moment, Jamal could see a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but the older man quickly masked it with a professional smile. That's wonderful," Dr. Smith said quietly. "I'm glad to hear that. You're a strong young man." Jamal nodded, but he didn't offer any more words. He didn't want to dwell on the past, nor did he feel the need to confront Dr. Smith. The past was behind him, and the future was where his focus needed to be. Still, it was strange seeing the man who had once denied him care, now trying to be a part of the same community that Jamal was a part of. Dr. Smith's voice broke the silence again. "Jamal, I know I'm not the person I was back then. I made mistakes, terrible ones, and I know I can never make up for what I did to you. But I've learned, I've changed." Jamal listened carefully. Part of him wanted to believe that Dr. Smith was sincere, but the other part of him was skeptical. He had learned that actions spoke louder than words. "I've been trying to do better," Dr. Smith continued, his voice softer now. "I've been working with organizations, trying to help in the ways I should have before. I've realized that I was wrong. What I did to you was unforgivable. I know that now." Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach, but he held his composure. "I've forgiven you, Dr. Smith," he said finally. "I don't carry that pain anymore. I've learned that it's not about holding on to anger. It's about what we do with the lessons we've learned." Dr. Smith's face softened, and Jamal could see the genuine remorse in his eyes. It was the first time Jamal had ever seen the doctor look vulnerable, as though he was truly sorry for his past behavior. "I'm glad to hear that, Jamal," Dr. Smith said quietly. "You've grown into an amazing young man. I'm proud of you." Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of closure. He didn't need to carry the weight of that memory anymore. He had a future to focus on, one that would make the world a better place. Dr. Smith's apology, while late, was a reminder that people could change, but it was Jamal's own actions and choices that would define his future. As Dr. Smith walked away, Jamal turned his attention back to the clinic. There was still so much work to be done, so many people to help. He was ready for whatever came next. The past was behind him, and the future was full of possibilities.